Hey, Walter Sorrells back with another Knife Makers Friday 5. Today we're talking handle design. So a couple months ago, one of my Patreon subscribers asked for me to do a video about handles, and maybe he didn't really know quite what he was unleashing, but this is actually the third in this whole series that request kind of sparked. The first two were kind of practical ones, so those were just kind of regular videos. This one is going to be more theoretical, so I thought it made sense for this to be one of my Friday Fives where I'm more discussing things than showing things. All right, so let's talk about handle design. You know, these days when you look at knives, a lot of times you look at a knife and you say, that's really cool looking, but you sort of also think like, what's the theory behind that? Is there some kind of reason why the designer made the handle the way that he did? And frankly, sometimes I think the answer is they just made it to look cool and there was no purpose beyond that. It's cool looking, but it really doesn't make any sense in a functional perspective. So what I'm going to be doing today is not talking about design from an aesthetic or how to make it look cool kind of standpoint. I'm just going to talk about kind of the thinking that I use to go through when I'm trying to design the handle for a knife. By the way, I'm going to try and make this into a little chart that'll sort of distill my thinking into something that you can look at schematically and say, okay, if I'm trying to do X, Y, Z kind of knife, then here are the kind of things that I should be thinking about and maybe some of the design elements that would normally be incorporated. I will put that on my Patreon page if I get around to making it. I'm not making any promises. I may get started on it and decide, like, okay, this is a stupid idea. But if I do get around to it, I'll put that on the Patreon page. You won't have to be a Patreon subscriber. It's just going to be available to the public. All right, let's talk handle design. So the first thing we start with is the human hand. Every knife, obviously, the handle goes in your hand, and that's what you're having to adapt to. Now, right here, I've got a machinist's parallel. This is not, designed to be a knife handle, and yet we could stick a knife blade on the end of this, and this would actually function pretty well. Why? Because the human hand is so remarkable, so versatile, so capable of doing so many different things. But, in a perfect world, we don't want to just use some, really sharp bar of steel as a handle for a knife. Why? Because we want it to be comfortable. We want it to be suited for the task. So I start with the presumption that if you're going to design a knife handle, the first thing you should do is to think about what the function of that knife is. It seems kind of obvious, but not every knife designer does that. So what are some of the functions that we would normally associate with a particular knife? Is it an everyday carry knife? Is it for self-defense? Is it for camping, hiking? Is it a chopper? Is it going to be used for brush clearing, military purposes, skinning? A bird and trout knife is a classic kind of little design. Survival. So my point here isn't I'm going to tell you, the cookbook, recipe for making a bird and trout knife handle, and here's how you should make a defense knife. But, generically, we can talk about some of the things that, some of the functions that we're going to be aiming for with a particular knife. So just to take one for an example, a chopper or a machete, something that's going to be swung very vigorously, a knife like that has to have some kind of retention feature, a lanyard, bird's beak, something like that. It needs to be very robust, and it needs to be comfortable. It needs to have rounded edges so that when you swing it repeatedly, you're not going to develop nasty hot spots that are going to blister your hands. Another type of knife that has a really completely different theory of the handle would be some kind of self-defense knife. In the case of a self-defense knife, you're going to need concealability. It's going to need to be small. It should be indexable, meaning that you should be able to take the knife out without actually looking at the knife and make sure that it's in exactly the position that you want it in your hand. You want something that's not going to snag on your clothes. But comfort in the sense that we would think of with a chopping knife or a camping knife or something like that, that's going to be used for repeated tasks and swung around really hard, not quite so important. So my point is, those are the kinds of things that you need to think about when you're thinking about a particular function for a knife, is to really go through, pretty rigorously through a list of all the qualities that you're going to want in that handle. All right, so let's go through what some of those qualities would be in a little bit more of an abstract or generic kind of way. First point is just size. Here, for instance, is a Tactics Armory Shadow, one of the knives that I make. This knife is intended to be fairly concealable and fairly light, but I wanted it to actually fill the entire hand. I always like to test them out. I have fairly normal sized hands, and I'm a guy of very average stature, and my hands are maybe a little on the large size for somebody my size, but certainly I don't have unusually large hands. And so if I can comfortably handle a knife, then most people it's going to be kind of in the normal range. If you're custom making a knife for somebody, you want to know if that guy has big hands, small hands. That's the kind of thing when I do a custom order that I always like to know about the customer before I get started, and that gives me a sense of what size that handle ought to be. Another important issue is strength. Again, this gets back to the suitability of the task. For some, a knife like this, let's say, that has kind of a self-defense and everyday carry application. For everyday carry, doesn't necessarily need to be all that strong, but for something that is going to be used in a self-defense type application, potentially, you really don't want it to ever have any possibility of failure there. And so you want to think about things, for instance, like, are there any stress risers around the handle, places where that handle might snap off? Are there pins in places that might cause weakness in the handle? Is the particular type of design that you're using, say, full tang as opposed to a hidden tang, does that enhance the strength that you might like for that particular kind of knife? Kind of similar to that is the issue of weight, and sometimes these qualities may have to play off against each other. So a good friend of mine's a high-ranking guy at NASA, and of course he's an engineer. One of the things that he said to me a long time ago that stuck in my head is, every engineering problem is a trade-off. In other words, there's no such thing as a perfect this or that. You're always going to be trading off one quality against another. Weight is one of those things that you may have to trade a little bit of durability or a little bit of strength or a little bit of cost, whatever it might be, in order to get something that weighs less. But for a hiker, let's say, weight's fairly important. Survival situations, maybe something that you're going to be carrying in a bag out in the boonies, that weight, can add up, and every little bit that you take out counts. Maybe in a situation like that, you want to hollow out the handle a little bit, or you want to use carbon fiber as opposed to, G10 or something that's a little bit heavier. So each one of those kind of considerations comes in based on the suited use that you have intended for that knife. Now let me get to what I think is probably, the thing that most people think about in terms of knife design, which is ergonomics. Ergonomics really means kind of the efficiency of the interface between a person and their environment, the tools that they use, and that sort of thing. So when we think about knife handle design, ergonomics is really kind of at the top of the list of things that we're thinking about. Now, here's one of the interesting things. When you talk to people about ergonomics, a lot of times what they think they mean is comfort. But here's the thing. Just because a knife is comfortable when you pick it up off the table at the knife show doesn't mean that it's actually ergonomic. So let me break that down a little bit and tell you what I mean by that. Probably the most comfortable knife possible, when you pick it up off a table at the knife show, would be something that really fits your hand perfectly, that has very rounded features, that's very soft in the hand. But that doesn't mean that it's actually ergonomically correct. The reason for that is that what you're looking for in ergonomics is something that's efficient for the task that you actually have in mind for a particular knife. This was kind of interesting to me. When I first got started, kind of my starting place for my Tactics Armory line was knives that you could carry every day, fixed blades that you can carry on your person, and you really didn't want big knives that were going to take up a lot of space and be obtrusive and easy to see. And so I later on designed my knife, the Pro, which is sort of a military knife. And I got some pushback from one of my early customers who said, the edges, the corners were too sharp, and it had hot spots and so forth. And what I realized is that I had used kind of the same design formula that made sense on my carry knives for a knife that was going to be used in fairly different kind of circumstances. If you look at the Pro today, it looks exactly the same as it did when I first designed it. But if you feel it, it feels different. I did a lot more rounding. I smoothed out some of the harder edges. And so, in other words, I gave some thought to how it's actually going to be used in the hand. That may make it more comfortable when you pick it up off the table at the knife show, but that's not the reason that I did it. The reason that I did it is because I thought a little bit more completely about what kind of use that particular knife was going to have. So to introduce the first ergonomic issue, indexing. A lot of people don't think about this, but this is a fairly thin and long knife. All things being equal, that's going to make it less rounded, less smooth. But the reason for that is that this is a knife that needs to be carried, and because of that, I want it as flat as possible. It's not intended for chopping. It's not intended for, use at the campsite particularly. You're not going to be chopping kindling with it. And as a result, I want it as thin as possible within reason. It still has smooth edges. It's still, it's not going to be sharp, but it's a different kind of theory from a chopping-oriented knife. When I say indexing, what I mean is that I can reach down and I can pick up this knife. I can pull it out of a concealed position on my body, the sheath that we've designed for it, and it's going to come right to an exact position. It's got a finger notch that's going to fit in my hand as I pull it out, and it's flat. And because it's flat, it's always going to be in a position that it's ready to use exactly at that moment. I don't have to look at it and fumble around to see, what it looks like. Much more rounded knives, which may be more comfortable for chopping, let's say, if you grab it, you might come out and I can't cut with it because it's flat to me, and I might not perceive that without looking at it. So a second ergonomic point is retention. Depending on the potential use of the knife, if you're going to be doing something that it might be getting oily or bloody or wet or anything like that, you really, really don't want it flying out of your hand. If you're going to be chopping, you don't want it flying out of your hand. So you need to think about features of the knife that might help you hold on to it. Those might include a guard, a finger notch, a bird's beak. That's the little protrusion that comes out and keeps your hand from slipping off the back. A lanyard, checkering. All of those things will help your grip on that knife and keep it from slipping out of your hand. Just as a for instance, really, really important, if you've ever made a machete or if you've used machetes, those things can fly out of your hands really easily if you're not careful. And if they do that, they can fly out and kill somebody or chop your own leg or whatever. So I always put a lanyard in a machete. Knife like this, not so important. This is something that I want to be able to take out, put back in. I don't want to have to fuss around with a lanyard. When we think about retention, what we think about typically is the knife flying out of your hand this way. But equally important is you don't want your hand to slip up onto the blade and cut yourself. So some of the same kinds of features that might help retention will also help you from not slipping forward on the knife. Those might include, checkering, finger grooves, things of that nature. A guard also will help your hand from sliding up onto the blade. Some other features that might help you to keep you from slipping forward are jimping, which is, if you're not familiar, that's little grooves, and thumb ramp is another thing often used with jimping. Another issue in ergonomics is concealability. That doesn't really have anything to do with how comfortable it is in your hand, but this is kind of my wheelhouse. When I first started Tactics Armory, all the original knives that I designed were designed to be carried on your person. Some people, when you talk about concealability, think about, scary, creepy people walking around with weapons, but that's really not my point here. There are work environments or places that you want to go that you just don't want to be advertising that you're carrying a knife. For whatever reason, the exact same knife, if it was a folding knife, seemed perfectly normal to some people, but if you're carrying a fixed blade, some people might take umbrage to that, and so concealability is something that you want to be thinking about for a fixed blade knife. So in the case of this Shadow, for instance, I made it nice and flat, but some other points are, I talked about a bird's beak earlier. In this case, I didn't do a bird's beak for a very specific purpose. That would increase retention, but at the same time, it creates something that can snag on clothes. So if you're going to be making a knife that you intend to have worn under clothes, you don't want it snaggy. Competition pistol shooters, for instance, put skateboard tape on the handles of their pistols sometimes. Now, you wouldn't want to do that with a pistol that you're intending to carry every day because it'll tear up your clothes. Same kind of thing with a concealable knife. This doesn't have any checkering or complicated grooves on the handle, and the reason for that is because those will tear up your clothes. So that's the kind of thing that you want to think about in terms of concealability. So this brings us to the point that people probably most think of when they think about ergonomics, which is comfort. And really, probably the first simple thing that you can do to make a knife comfortable in the hand is just to round off the corners of the handle scales. The thing to keep in mind about comfort is, to some degree anyway, comfort actually can be the enemy of utility. What I mean by that is that if a handle becomes too rounded, it'll want to rotate in your hands. It can slip out of your hands. So the more aggressive the things that you might be doing with it, or the more important it is that you be able to deploy the knife and have it in a consistent position every time, the less that you want to round off the entire handle. So you're always trying to find kind of a happy medium between retention, indexing, and things of that nature, and just pure, how comfortable is this in my hand? Am I going to create hot spots when I'm, say, chopping or doing repetitive motions like that? All right, another point to think about when we're thinking about handle design is the carry interface, I call it. So if you're designing outdoor knives with handle guards, and you know that you're going to be using, say, a leather sheath that is going to have a little snap or some kind of retention feature like that, you can design the handle however you want. But a lot of folks these days, and I'm one of them, use kydex for sheaths. Very, very important point when you're designing a blade for a kydex sheath. You have to have some kind of little indent here, or somewhere on the knife, that can act as a detent to retain the knife in the kydex. If you don't have some kind of feature that the kydex can grip onto and form a little depression or detent, then your knife will just go flying out of that sheath the minute you start moving around with it. So the general point there is you can design a knife and just design the knife for its use, and then come back later and try and figure out how to sheath the thing, or you can try and design that integrally. So when I design the handle, I'm always thinking, one step down the road, how am I going to make the sheath for this so that the whole thing works as a system, as opposed to designing the knife and then coming back later and going, oh, how am I going to make a sheath for this thing? All right, so let's wrap this up with the last point, which is manufacturability. Now, if you're a hobbyist knife maker, you might be thinking, oh, well, I'm only going to be making this one knife here, one knife there, and so, who cares how hard it is to make? That's a valid point, and especially if you're making custom one-off type knives, you may just want to be able to make a knife and present your customer, or maybe you're making it for yourself. You just want a knife to suit for a particular purpose. You don't want to be worrying about whether it's hard to make or easy to make. So even if you're not selling a whole ton of knives, once every blue moon you might sell one to some guy at work or whatever, it's always useful to think about, well, what kinds of features can I design into this knife handle in particular, that'll make it a little bit easier to make, and that I can do it in a weekend as opposed to 3 weekends or whatever it might be. And this is something that I think especially guys who've only made a few knives don't think about, and probably don't need to think about. But really, once you get a little bit further down the road, this starts to become more and more important, and this is what I call fixturability. So let me back up a little bit on that point. What do I mean by fixturability? Well, if you're just going to make one knife and it's going to be one design, and then you're going to make another knife and it's going to be totally different, and then another knife that's totally different, you're not going to be building little fixtures or jigs or anything to align parts and repeat parts the same way. Because every knife's totally different. And you know, when I started out, all the knives that I made were different, and so I never made fixtures to hold them. However, once you make a design, you say, this is a standard design that I make, and you're going to see it several times. You know, this shadow, for instance, I've made gazillions of these things. And so I'm doing the same kind of operation each time. And as a result, you know, I'm setting it up, and of course I've got a CNC machine and, you know, various other fairly high-tech things, but you don't have to have that. Even if you just have a drill press, you may want to be drilling similar holes every time. And if you make a little fixture, say a drill guide, that's going to allow you to consistently drill holes 3 inches apart, then you might want to design your handles so that you can use that 3-inch drill guide on lots and lots of different knives. Save you tons of time, but probably the most important thing about fixtures is not that they allow you to save time on something. They also increase your quality. In other words, if you can repeat the exact same thing, the precision of your operations goes up. And, you know, as a result, the fit of all the little parts is better. You don't have little gaps. That makes the finish better. So I strongly encourage people, even if you're not making tons and tons of knives, always be thinking about, you know, is there a way that I can make some kind of little fixture here that is going to allow me to make 2 knives or 3 knives or 100 knives or whatever it might be. So that all kind of circles back to design. If you start with a clean sheet of paper every time and don't give any consideration to where your pins are, the little holes that you drill in the tang, then every time it's a whole new thing, and you got to measure and figure it out. But if you could make some kind of little drill guide that's going to be exactly 3 inches apart, maybe you make 2 handles, totally different knives, everything looks different about them. Customer would never say, oh, this is a standard design, because it's not. But by having those hole pins drilled in the same, or pinholes drilled, you know, at 3-inch intervals using a little drill guide, you saved yourself a ton of time. You made something that was more precise, and ultimately the knife that you make is going to be better. So like I said, I'm going to try and boil this down to a sheet of paper, a couple sheets of paper, so that you know, you'd be able to refer to it and you know, kind of look schematically at it and figure out, okay, if I'm making a certain kind of knife, here's some of the things that I need to think about when I'm designing that knife. All right, so hope you enjoyed that. Like I said, check it out on Patreon. I think I should have one on there pretty soon. Like I said, not going to have to be a Patreon member. It'll just be available to the public. Of course, we always love you more if you help us on the Patreon page. All right, thanks very much, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching, guys. If you feel like you got something out of this video, don't forget to subscribe. Also, click on the link to Patreon for a great way to give back to the channel. Plus, check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Links in the description. If you want something sharp and pointy, maybe a gift for yourself or one of the cooler people in your life, check out my Tactics Armory website and pick up one of our tactical or outdoor knives. And finally, if you want to learn to make Hamones or Japanese swords, check out WalterSorrellsBlades.com, where you can find videos about how I make Hamones, as well as forging, mounting, polishing, and fittings for Japanese swords. Thanks, and see you soon.